Ruth Ware is an international #1 bestseller. Her thrillers, In a Dark, Dark Wood, The Woman in Cabin 10, The Lying Game, The Death of Mrs. Westaway, The Turn of the Key, and One by One have appeared on bestseller lists around the world, including the Sunday Times and the New York Times bestseller lists. Her books have been optioned for both film and TV, and she is published in more than 40 languages. Ruth lives near Brighton in the UK, and her latest novel is The It Girl. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ruth.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here and without having to fly all the way to Australia.
I know, the wonders of technology, right? Now, the It Girl, your latest novel, tell us what it's about.
Well, okay, so I've had some practice summing it up now. Um, it's about a bookseller called Hannah. She lives in Edinburgh with her husband, Will, her college sweetheart, Will. They're expecting their first baby. On the face of it, life is pretty idyllic. But we learn that Hannah has trauma in her past, something that she's been trying to forget for 10 years. And as the book starts, that trauma is brought back to her when her mum phones her up at work and says John Neville is dead. And we don't at first know who he is, but we quickly learn that when Hannah was at university, her roommate April was killed. Hannah found her murdered, strangled in their college suite. And the college porter, John Neville, was convicted largely on Hannah's evidence. But 10 years later, Neville has died in prison, still protesting his innocence. And his death forces Hannah to face up to the fact that she has never been completely happy with his conviction. There's questions that she's never been able to answer. There's loose ends that were never tied up. And when a podcaster comes nosing around, asking further questions that making her consider things that she hadn't thought about, she's forced to admit that possibly she got it wrong 10 years ago. And even worse than that, an innocent man could have died in prison, and one of her close friends might actually be the person responsible for April's death. So that's like the first two chapters. There's no spoilers there. So she goes off on a quest to try and find out who really killed April.
Now, what gave you this idea?
Um, it's always really difficult to pin down inspirations for novels. I mean, sometimes there's like a really clear conversation that I can point to and say, yes, it was that, or, a newspaper article that you read where you're like, wouldn't it have been weird if it had turned out this way instead of that way? In this case, I think the influences are much harder to sort of pick apart. But I think when I was about 2/3 of the way through writing the book, I realized that a lot of it was coming from a personal experience of mine, which was doing jury service several years ago now. And thank goodness the case wasn't anywhere near as serious as the one that Hannah experiences in the book. But I found it surprisingly, I don't want to say traumatic because I think that kind of overstates the level of my involvement. But I did find it a huge and daunting responsibility. I found it preyed on my mind in a way that I hadn't been expecting. I took it really seriously. And I think all of the people involved in the case did as well, all of the other jurors. And I was just really, really shocked by how upsetting the whole situation was. And I'd sort of gone into it thinking, oh, it'll be great to do my civic duty and find out a bit more about the justice system. And I came away really convinced that any involvement with the justice system is a profoundly bruising experience, and that was just me as a juror in a very privileged, insulated way. I couldn't imagine how much more traumatic and upsetting it would be to be a witness or a defendant or someone who had suffered a crime themselves, and to be put through days and days of questioning and disbelief and having your arguments picked apart. And I started to think about what it would be like to be that person, to be involved in a much more intimate way with a case. And then I guess because I'm a writer and it's our natural instinct to push things to extreme, I sort of tried to put myself in the shoes of what I felt would be like the worst case scenario for me, which would be being involved in a case where in some way I had made a huge and really serious mistake. So that is the mill that I put poor Hannah through in the book.
Now, did you always want to be an author? Did you always want to be a writer, even from when you were very young?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I don't even know that I would say I wanted to be a writer. I think I was just a really instinctive storyteller right from when I was tiny. And it started off with me, telling stories to my sister about our teddies and our dolls. And my Barbie dolls always had these, incredible Jackie Collins sagas of love affairs and vengeance. And, I was kind of spinning plots from a really young age, but I didn't know any writers growing up. I didn't none of my friends' parents were involved in the arts. It just didn't seem like something a normal regular person could do. And I remember having a conversation with my mum when I was probably about 5 or 6, and her saying, what would you like to be when you grow up? And me saying, well, I think I'd like to be a writer. And she said, which was both kind of very sensible advice, but also maybe a bit too crushing for a 6-year-old. She said, well, that would be lovely, but I think maybe a lot of other people might want to be writers too. So perhaps you should have a plan B. So if it doesn't work out, is there anything else that you would like to do? And I said, well, do you think it's a job writing the descriptions on the backs of books? And she was like, yeah, I guess somebody must be paid to do that. And I was like, okay, well, that's what I'd like to do. If I can't be a writer, I'd like to write the descriptions on the backs of books.
Oh my
So,
goodness, you thought this at the age of 6?
yeah, that was the pinnacle of my ambitions. I still do have a plan B. I think it's really good advice for anybody, but particularly writers, because it's such a precarious career. With so much that's not in your control. But now my plan B would be to be an accountant. I think I'd be a really good accountant.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely. I love a good spreadsheet. I enjoy all the kind of, like, I don't love doing my taxes, but I really enjoy the satisfaction of, I'm quite a numbers person, and I like the way numbers slot together in a way where you know that you're right, in a way that doesn't happen with words, which are much more slippery and ephemeral. So yeah, that's my plan B.
So you went off to Manchester University, and what did you study there?
I studied English literature and language, which on the one hand was a great excuse to read books for 3 years. I don't think it did anything at all for my writing. I'm often asked if, should people do a creative language course? Is it necessary to have studied English literature? I had a lovely time for 3 years. I didn't write at all for 3 years because I don't know about anybody else, but certainly my experience of doing an English literature degree was basically having this fire hose of literature aimed at me, starting from like sort of the Dream of the Rood old English texts right up to sort of 20th century classics, and just being expected to absorb as much of this as you possibly can, which is it's quite intimidating and quite anti-creative in a way, because you're just being buffeted with other people's words so much that you don't really have any space to think about your own. But it definitely, it gave me a really solid grounding in the classics. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about how stories are constructed, what makes a good narrative, why certain things work. But I think ultimately, for me anyway, writing is a much more instinctive process than that. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it made me into a writer or a better writer, but it was certainly nice to spend 3 years just reading and enjoying books.
And just having the uni life. But
Yeah.
let's move forward then. After your university, and you did have the space to write your own stories, what did that look like? When were you writing, and what was your break?
Well, I was writing in the evenings and at weekends. I had a pretty full-on job, but I started working in the book trade, which on the one hand actually really was a very good preparation for writing a book, because it forces you to think about literature in a completely different way, from the point of view of bookshops and readers, and where does this book sit in the market. But on the other hand, it gave me a huge attack of stage fright, because I was working with all these incredible writers who were like, Booker Prize winners, Orange Prize winners, Nobel Prize winners in some cases. And it just made it increasingly hard to sort of hold my sort of slightly ugly duckling attempts on my hard drive up against the books that I was working with. So I kept writing, but I kept not doing anything with the books that I was writing. They just sort of went under the bed in a metaphorical sense. And then when I was in my 30s, I went off on maternity leave with my second baby. And I realized that I had no time for hobbies anymore and that my writing was basically a hobby. I had two kids, I had a job, I had all the like myriad responsibilities of trying to like keep a household together and feed a family, and just there just weren't enough hours in the day. I barely had time to wash my hair, let alone bang out novels. um and I realized that unless I made space for this in my life in a really practical way, like made it earn its place, I was not going to be able to carry on doing this for at least the next 5 to 10 years and possibly longer. And I thought, I have the length of my maternity leave before I go back to work and this all kind of starts again. I need to write something that I'm proud to send out, and I need to find the courage to try and get an agent. So yeah, so that's what I did.
So you have an alter ego because you started writing as Ruth Warburton and you wrote young adult fantasy novels and you wrote several of those, but then you shifted, changed genres, changed name, changed the type of story, the settings that your characters were in. What prompted this?
Well, I think so. When I started writing YA was actually it was a fairly deliberate decision, in the sense of I was working in adult fiction publishing. And so writing YA felt a slightly safer thing to do because I didn't know anyone in the YA sphere. The editors are completely different. The agents are by and large completely different, although my agent does do a bit of both. So it felt like a sort of safe space to fail in a way. So I the first five novels that I wrote, and the novels that got me my agent, were young adult novels. And having written five of those, I had an idea for a book. I was having coffee with a friend and she said that she'd never read a thriller set on a hen night. And I've always been a thriller addict. I love reading them. Psychological thrillers are among my favorite genres. Some of my like all-time desert island books are psychological thrillers. But I'd never tried to write one. And as soon as she said this, I was like, that's really weird. I haven't read one fitting that description either, and it's a really great idea. I don't know why no one's written it. And then I thought, I want to read this book and it doesn't exist, so maybe I should write it. But very clearly, there was no way that a thriller set on a hen night could ever be a YA novel. There's a lot of things that you can tackle in YA. There's very few off-limit topics, but it's quite hard to think of a natural reason why a sort of 15-16-year-old would be getting married. Mm-hmm. So it was clearly never going to be a YA novel. And I sort of had the choice of, did I want to stick with my existing kind of niche more, or did I want to write this novel more? And I really, really wanted to write the novel. So I wrote the novel, and actually, although it is a change of genre, I don't think, to me anyway, it doesn't feel very different writing adult novels for adults than it does for teenagers. Teenagers are pretty sophisticated. You don't really have to tone down your vocabulary much. You might take out a few swear words, but that's it really. They're slightly pacier, but only I write basically the same for each genre. It's just that the process of editing for my YA novels was always much more about cutting, and the process of editing for my adult novels is usually about expanding and adding in detail. So my writing has sort of remained more or less the same. It's just the editing process has slightly changed.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think it's cutting for YA but adding for the adult thrillers?
I just think there is more of a convention of pace in YA novels. They're just a little bit faster. Adults will stick with you often a little bit more in terms of description and introspection. I mean, it's obviously there's like exceptions to the rule in everything. You can find very, very short, pacey adult novels and very descriptive, lengthy YA novels. But in general, that is what editors in each genre want. I think you just have to compete a little bit harder for teenagers' attention. They've got a lot going on in their lives between school and social lives. And so you really have to work to give them a reason to turn the page. But yeah, but that was the extent of it, really. And then the request to change my name came from my publishers because I think they didn't want my little 13-year-old readers accidentally picking up an adult book and then getting, complaints about the content or whatever. So it was never a secret, but it was more a way of just saying these books are for adults, these are for kids, and making it really clear in the branding. Yeah.
So the first thriller became In a Dark, Dark Wood, which then goes nuts. Reese Witherspoon decides she wants to make a movie out of it. And it's not actually the only book of yours that has been optioned for film. You then follow that with several other psychological thrillers, some of which become New York Times bestsellers. When did you get the news that you were a New York Times bestseller? Do you
So the
recall?
first, yeah, I do. They've actually all become New York Times bestsellers. Touch wood. I probably shouldn't jinx myself now, but yeah, so far, every single one has hit the list, which is pretty cool.
When it came
Um,
out?
uh, so In a Dot Wood, it was the second week, I think, and I'd just done NPR, which
Oh.
is obviously like a big deal in the US. It was very cool. And I remember I was at home and it was about 11 o'clock at night because that's when the list comes out in the States, is like sort of 7 o'clock in the evening. And for us, that's much later, obviously. And my husband was asleep. My kids at the time were very small, so they were all in bed. And I got a phone call, which was quite unusual. And it was my editor saying, "You've made the list." And I was never expecting it. I don't know if they were. I imagine they were hoping, but I don't think there was sort of any great certainty about it. And yeah, I just remember just dancing around the living room, but really quietly because I didn't want to wake anybody up. And then creeping up to bed and saying to my husband, "The book's on the New York Times bestseller list," and him being like, "Well done, dear," half asleep. So yeah, it was
Oh
a
my
lovely
God.
moment.
And now it's just like, oh, expected. That's
Well, fingers crossed.
fantastic. Oh my God. Okay, that's brilliant. So let's talk about this particular book, The It Girl. Can you tell us um what the gestation period was? So how long it took for you to do your first draft, or a draft that you were happy with, and what your writing routine is on a daily basis?
Well, so this book was a funny one because I've done a book a year every year since my first book. And 2020 was the first year that I didn't write a book for obvious reasons. We were all in lockdown. I was homeschooling my kids. My husband is a virologist, so there was no way he could take any time off, really. Although he did try really hard to claw back time to support, me and the kids. But I just didn't have the headspace or the time to write a book for the first time in a long time. And so, yeah, 2020 was the first year that I did not write a book. So 2021 was the first year I didn't have one out. And I spent the year, yeah, wrestling with Teams, learning how to use Zoom, all the other things that the rest of us did. And I was incredibly lucky to be able to take that break. If I'd had a career where I had to be online all the time, I just don't know how we would have survived the year. But I came out of it just bursting to write. I at the time I didn't think I had anything to write, and I think in common with a lot of writers, I had that kind of like, oh my goodness, what is the point of my job? When my husband was sort of downstairs trying to, like, with all of his colleagues trying to figure out what the heck was going on and how they could, fix this. I was sort of thinking, well, I write slightly silly stories for a living. What's the point of this? But I think, as it went on, I think we all became more and more aware of the importance of having an avenue of escape, having entertainment, book sales rocketed during lockdown. So did streaming services. I think we all wanted an escape into story and a way of understanding what was happening to us. Um, so I sort of fell in love with story a little bit over the course of that year, and came out of it just desperate to write, because the older I get, the more I realize that writing is my way of processing stuff and figuring stuff out, and I hadn't been able to do it for a year. So once I was back at my desk, which happened kind of autumn 2020, I guess, although we did then have another extra little mini lockdown just for fun. I was one of the fastest books that I'd written since In a Dark, Dark Wood. It just kind of poured out of me. So I think, not counting the break that we had for the extra lockdown, I think it was probably about 4 months of writing, which was pretty quick for me. It normally takes me about 6. And my writing day is very it's very kind of officey.
Officey.
So when I gave up my day job, I promised myself that I would treat writing like a day job. Because for so long I'd had to kind of cram it into weekends and evenings. And I thought, I am going to treat this like a job, because it now is my job. Partly to give it like the seriousness that it deserves. I didn't want, I've seen other writers struggling with friends and families not treating their work like work because it's fun, and feeling free to ring them up in the middle of it and expect them to drop everything. And I thought, I have to treat this like a job, otherwise the other people in my life won't. But also I wanted to make sure that evenings and weekends were for decompression and for my family. And so I try pretty hard. I sit down at the desk at 9 a.m. after my kids have gone off to school. I write until about 3, which is when they break. I take a break for lunch sometimes. If the writing's going really well, I sometimes write straight through and then sort of emerge blinking and realize that I haven't had any food. But after that, I try to shut it down, and I keep my work in progress only on the computer that's in my office at my desk, which is partly to stop myself from sort of obsessing over it and fiddling with it in the evenings and at weekends. But partly, one of my favorite places to write is in bed. But unfortunately, I've screwed up my back doing that. So this is a way of forcing me to sit in a proper chair, properly adjusted with a proper screen at a proper height, and that's just much better for my body all round. And yeah.
Do you have a word count goal, a daily word count goal, or weekly or anything?
No, I don't. I mean, I count words in the sense of I've got the tally at the bottom of my screen, because it's that's an automatic part of Word. But I don't think word counts are a very useful measure of progress. You can have a better day deleting 500 words of rubbish than writing 500 mediocre words. So I sort of refuse to feel good about one and bad about the other. I try to make sure that I've made progress with my book every day, and that it's in better shape at the end than it was at the beginning, but that doesn't have to be adding words. If I feel that the book is closer to what I want it to be at the end of the day, that's how I measure progress. But obviously I have a knowledge in the back of my head that I need to hit 100,000 words ish, by whatever the deadline is for that book. So on some level, part of me is sort of thinking, can I write 60,000 words in however many months, and keeping a tally of how panicked I am. But that's a very, just a subjective thing that I sort of, it's just more or less, how pressured do I feel to get the words down? It's not like, did I do 1,000 words today, tick. Otherwise, so yeah.
When you start writing, do you know what's going to happen? Do you already know how it's going to be resolved? Or do you just start writing?
I almost always know who did it, and how, and why, usually, although sometimes the why is the bit that gets tweaked most. I think because the kind of books that I write, I really want to give the reader a fair shake at guessing the outcome. And I can only do that if I sow the seeds for the reader in the first place. So if I don't lay those clues and drop those breadcrumbs, I don't feel that I've given the reader a fair chance. But obviously, I can only drop the clues if I know what the solution is. So that's usually one of the first things that I work out when I'm figuring out what the book is about. Beyond that, I don't always know what's going to happen when I sit down at my desk in a given day. I don't really outline. So I have sort of scenes that I know I want to write, things that I think would be cool to include in the plot, strands that I want to introduce. But the order that they happen in, how exactly I get from A to B, all of that is kind of up for grabs, really.
So this book, so the It Girl has two timelines. There's before when they're younger, and then there's after. It's after the incident. And the timelines alternate. And so I'm curious to know, since you love spreadsheets, whether you plotted that out on a spreadsheet somewhere or whether you wrote the timelines in a linear fashion and then pieced them together, or did you, write alternate time periods as you went along?
Yeah, so although I do enjoy a good spreadsheet, I don't use them for plotting at all. I don't think I've ever used them in my writing. I don't really outline formally. I occasionally, the most I'll do usually, unless my publishers ask for something, which sometimes they do, the most I'll do is have a paragraph at the bottom of my Word document with key dates in it, which I did do for this just because there were quite a lot of complicated things in terms of Hannah's pregnancy, which obviously had to progress at a set rate. And then the academic year. For anybody who hasn't read the book, the before timeline is set during the first year of Hannah's time at Oxford University. And the after timeline is set 10 years later when she's at living in Edinburgh with her husband and working at a bookshop, but she is also pregnant. So obviously there were specific things that could only happen at certain times in her pregnancy. And again, back in the before timeline, there were specific things that could only happen at certain parts of the academic year. So I had maybe like a paragraph of sort of key dates of this happens then, Hannah is 26 weeks pregnant at date or whatever it was. But that was it. That was purely to keep it straight. And I always write, whether it's dual timeline or dual narrator or whatever it is, I always write in the order that you read it. Because I think with thrillers, so much of the book is about the back and forth between the reader and the writer in terms of what I hope you think and the information that I've given to you and the theories that you might be constructing with that information. And the only way that I, as the writer, can keep track of what I've told you is to experience those events in the same order that I've given them to you. If I wrote one timeline, I wouldn't have any idea of what I had already conveyed in the other timeline, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't know where we were in terms of suspicion and so on. So so I always write in the order that you read it, because I think to do anything else would really disrupt that thread of information received and conveyed.
Now, the before timeline is, as you say, when they're at Oxford. And you've got this setting of Oxford University. And I'm wondering, because Oxford is just such a popular setting for books, movies, television shows. We've got very recently, we've had The Reunion by Polly Phillips. We've had Anatomy of a Scandal, obviously, by Sarah Vaughan. I mean, we had Brideshead Revisited, right? I mean, it's there. You don't get that many books set in Birmingham Polytechnic or something. So what does Oxford bring to these sorts of stories?
I mean, I think there's about 25 different answers to that. One is just that it's like visually, it's a really beautiful place. I always think if I'm going to spend the best part of a year somewhere in my imagination. I want it to be somewhere really fun. And there's a reason people go on holiday to Oxford to wander around the streets, because it's just like, it's a really lovely place to spend time. And it's all of that makes it a fun place to spend time in your imagination as well. The huge number of books and TV shows and so on set in Oxford is a double-edged sword, because of course you want to do something a little bit different, you want to add something, you want to not tread over the same ground again and again. But on the other hand, you know that your reader has quite a lot of tools to understand that world. You don't need to spend quite as much time describing and explaining, because most people will have a preconception of what an Oxford College looks like already. So it's more about filling in the little quirky blanks and the things that they might not know, and the little details that maybe you haven't noticed anywhere else. So it's sort of, there's pluses and minuses in those terms. But I think, part of the reason why we've seen such an explosion of Oxford novels and TV shows recently is because, certainly in the UK at the moment, there is a real kind of appraisal going on of what the private school and Oxbridge system does to society. Our Prime Minister has an Etonian background, went to Oxford, and there's been so many revelations about, the level of privilege involved in places like the Bullingdon Club, and, some of the attitudes that come out of that. That is a fascinating subject to explore. It's not something that I look at super overtly in my novel, but there's definitely like the whole sort of panoply of class friction, and the fact that university for many people is the first time that they will come into contact with people from backgrounds radically different to their own. When you're at school, it's very often with people from certainly a geographically similar background, because you're all from the same town very usually, probably a culturally similar background as well, because you grew up in the same area, and definitely an economically similar background, because if you're wealthy and you're going to private school, you're only going to mix with people from a similar economic bracket, whereas if you went to state school, as I did, you're probably not going to mix with sons of dukes and lords and things. And I remember a friend who went to Oxford saying to me, there's a girl on my landing who's the daughter of a viscountess, and sort of thinking, well, I sort of knew these people did exist, but in a very theoretical way. They seem about as real to me as kind of fairies or pixies or something. Like viscountess, who knew? They're real. And Oxford is, they're trying hard to widen access. How successfully they're doing that is up for debate, but certainly it's for both ends of the sort of social sphere. It was definitely the first time that my friend was in a friendship with the daughter of a viscount, and it was probably for the daughter of a viscountess the other way around. My friend may have been the first person that she'd met who was from a council estate. So suddenly you're in contact with people from radically different backgrounds, radically different experiences, and really the only thing that you have in common is that you have met the entry requirements to get into Oxford or Cambridge. And that just makes for intrinsically very interesting territory. That friction, that comparison, all of that is fun to write about. And all universities exemplify that to a certain extent, because it's just a very different way of sorting people to the rest of the educational structure. But Oxford and Cambridge, I think, exemplify it to its extremes, and that therefore is the one of the more interesting playgrounds to talk about in books.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm pretty sure that you're never going to need to become an accountant, particularly with so many New York Times bestsellers under your belt. I always end with, what are your top 3 tips to listeners who would love to have their own New York Times bestsellers out there one day?
Well, of course, the bottom line is that if I knew the secret, I would stop stressing as much, because every time I open that blank Word document and realize that I've got to write another book, I get that kind of lurch of fear of, oh, how do you do this again? And if I had a little post-it on my wall that told me how, I would certainly feel a lot better. And I would bottle it and make my fortune selling it to other novelists. So that is probably the sad truth, is that there is no secret. As Ian Rankin put it, the secret to having a long career in publishing is to get lucky and stay lucky, and I certainly feel that I got very lucky. But I think for me, probably the sort of three tenets that I try to stick to. One, I think having an ending in mind and working towards that ending. If you're writing a book for the first time, that is great advice, because so many people peter out after the first 10,000 words, first 30,000 words. And undoubtedly, there are specific low points in a book, for me anyway. And that 30,000 mark is a really common one. And I know from talking to other writers that it's often a sticking point for them as well, because you run out of that initial kind of burst of inspiration and that sort of, oh, I want to write this book, it sounds so cool kind of idea. And that's when you've got to decide what the book is about, figure out what happens in the middle, and having an ending to work towards, an ending that you're excited to write, goes a really long way in pulling you through that sort of moment of angst. So yeah, I would say number one, have an ending in mind, and force yourself to write it. Don't worry if you hit points where you think that the book isn't your best work. You can go back and fix that. Number two, I would say the thing that I always try really hard to do is give people a reason to turn the page. And that can be a big question like, who did this murder? But one question isn't going to sustain your readers throughout the book. There has to be a lot of small questions, and you have to answer some of them, because it's very irritating as a reader to feel that the writer is withholding information. So ideally you want a series of overlapping mysteries, some of which get answered pretty quickly, some of which are stretched out for the duration of the book, some of which are a surprise to the reader, some of which are a validation to the reader because they guessed right and this happened. And having a combination of those is a really good idea. And one thing that it took me quite a long time to learn as a writer is that one of the most pleasurable feelings as a writer is having a really cool scene or a really cool reveal up your sleeve and being excited to write it and for the reader to get to it. It's a bit like having a really amazing Christmas present for someone. You're like, oh, I just can't wait for them to get to this. But of course, the problem is that the reader doesn't know that it's coming. They don't know that you have this amazing surprise for them. And so what feels like delicious anticipation to you as the writer can be just fairly boring to the reader. So you have to give yourself reasons to write, but you also have to signpost to the reader when something cool is happening. Or it can be a complete surprise, which is also great. But if it is a complete surprise, then you have to give them another reason that they're being pulled through the page, so that the surprise is a bonus rather than something that you knew about and they didn't. And the final thing, which I think I wish I had learned earlier, and it was certainly what stopped me from putting my work out into the world earlier, was just give yourself permission to fail. I was too frightened of writing a book that other people didn't like, too frightened of being rejected, too frightened of publishing a book that I wasn't, for some reason didn't feel proud of. And I think I wish I'd been less scared. For me, writing a book is always a process of tricking myself into thinking that nobody will read it. I have to have this kind of bubble where I inhabit it all by myself. The book is just for me. I don't need to worry about making mistakes. I'm not going to show it to anybody. It doesn't matter. I can be as cringy as I like. I can put in sex scenes that I don't want anyone to read, or, weird stuff that I'll probably remove in the edit, because I know that the next draft will be about making it into a book that I'm proud to send out into the world. And so I think, I would just say, give yourself permission to fail, give yourself permission to make mistakes, and know that it isn't the end of the world if you do.
Brilliant. And on that note, congratulations on the It Girl. Everyone, go get yourself a coffee. And thank you so much for your time today, Ruth.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.